multiple millions of lines of code. And we know that we had one number where we initially tried using Coverity as a company that comes in, they do analysis of all of your code, and they gave us like 100 issues as a promo of, here's some things that our tool found in there. And they said, it's a really high-quality code base, that this, usually we find a bunch more things than this. And I preen a little bit at that, so it's like it's great that we've got a good team of programmers on this. And they wanted like $50,000 for this software tool. And if you thought that, well, it's going to save you looking stupid when you ship your game on there, that's a completely reasonable thing. But we figured we would get back to looking into that when we got closer to shipping. But later on, I started looking at some other tools options that were available. One of the really great things available is Microsoft has some pretty high quality. Microsoft actually has a very interesting research department that does a lot of things. Microsoft Research has a lot of really smart people in, and they do a lot of work covering a lot of different areas. But they productized some of their work that had been research early on, and they've got analyze options for the compilers. Now, normally, you only get that on your super ultra platinum premium $10,000 Visual Studio on there. But interestingly, for the 360 development kit, everybody gets that option. Now, most developers either aren't even aware of it or don't want to turn it on, don't want to deal with it. But it's an interesting thought there where I guess you can draw the conclusion that Microsoft figures they're not going to get blamed for buggy PC apps, but they will shoulder some blame for buggy 360 apps. So they're going to make these tools that make significant differences available for free to 360 developers. And I'll say this quite clearly with no hesitation. Any 360 developers that are listening to this, if you're not using Analyze, you are making a mistake. It is enlightening to see what happens when you turn this on. We found, so we had come out of this Coverity stuff with 100-ish issues or so on there. We had certainly grown a lot of code since then. We had a lot of new programmers, but when we first turned on the Microsoft analysis stuff, it found hundreds and hundreds of things. Now, some of them are the cases where you get a programmer and say, that's not really an error, I know what I'm doing, look, this guarantees that this doesn't make this happen, and it's okay. And there were plenty of those, but there were also tons of things where you look at this and say, it's saying, potential null pointer access here. And you're like, well, I'm checking up there, but nope, not checking down there, you're right. And when you see things like that happen over and over and over again, hundreds of times, you start looking at this in a very different way. Because everybody thinks about programming and development where it's like, okay, we bang the bugs out of it, we get the code good, now it's good solid stuff, we'll deal with things in maintenance. And there's, when you talk about reliability theory and different things that people analyze when they're talking about traditional engineering structures, there's a lot of debate that goes into things about how, well, software is just different. We can take our metals and we can get our spread of ultimate tensile strengths and yield strength and do all of this. And this is how you look at failures. You add up all of these tolerances and you can do all of your analyses and figure out some estimate about how reliable it's going to be. But you can't look at software like that because software is supposedly deterministic. Either it works or it doesn't. It has no chance of failing given the same input. And there's truth to that, and you can argue that in a certain way. But when you start looking at large enough bodies of software, millions of lines, dozens of developers, there does get to be a distressingly statistical nature to the amount of failures that you see, where software may be deterministic going through things, assuming you don't have uninitialized variables and randomized memory locations. But the development process of building that software is very much a statistical process where every programmer in the company has put things in that come out and that are just wrong. You make them up and before I got into the static code analysis, I did another exercise where I tried to keep a log of the personal errors that I made, where you write the code, you don't count the things just where you're compiling it, getting it to work, and not blow up on the very first time that you get it to run, but keeping a log of the things where, all right, I think it's working, and then all the things that you find days or weeks or months later that were actually wrong. And there were patterns in there. There were things that that I could see that I was doing where a common paradigm, if you're dealing with pairs or triples of numbers, you've got like a .x, a .y, .z. It's very, very common to say, all right, copy that line, paste, change the x's to y's and the y's to z's, and go through all of that. Happens all the time. There's tons of code that does that. But I noticed that, when I looked at this over 6 months, I had 3 errors that crept through, that were not immediately discovered, that only came up later, that was a result of not doing that particular thing right. And they were subtle things like, oh, the alpha channel was screwed up on this image that I never looked at because I was actually copying the blue channel because I didn't change a Z to a W or something. And something happens once, you say, well, it's an anomaly. 2 or 3 times you start seeing trends and start looking and saying, well, what do you do to make this not happen? And in those cases, the obvious things are you use either loops or templates or objects or something so that you don't have this thing. You don't want to feel inclined